We'll return the Burton and King article about the health benefits of positive writing, the Hurst, Barrick, and Daniel article about sources of stress, and the O'Hare and Scher article about drinking for examples. Please open those articles before you move on. Going back to the focus helps us identify the variable. It's easier when they identify a prediction or a hypothesis because that tends to directly state the variables. Then we just have to figure out which parts are what they think will vary and which parts are describing how they will vary. Burton and King make it a little trickier by talking about different levels of the variables and using slightly different wording in the goal sentence compared to the prediction. If we think about that wording and what they appear to be interested in, we get the idea that they're interested in three variables: writing, mood, and health. Then we look for the operational definitions to know specifically how they defined each variable. This is another case where knowing about APA style helps give us an idea where to look. We know that it should be in the methods section. Skimming this section, the first variable we see is mood. We can use the highlighted information to summarize the operational definition. Your notes on the article summary template should include at least the information included in the example on this slide. Note that the summary template includes a note about recording the citation, if that's available. This is an example of where the citation isn't included, so we can assume the authors developed the measure for this study. We still have two more variables, so we'll continue skimming the methods section. In the procedures section, we find the first mention of the writing manipulation, where we learned they operationalized it in terms of writing for 20 minutes a day for 3 consecutive days. The header writing instructions below the procedures signals that we'll find more information about the operational definition of writing. The explanation actually started a little bit before that, though, in the procedures section, as I noted in the last slide. I hope the phrases "participants read the following instructions" and "experimental condition" help signal that the writing variable was manipulated. For the article summary, we can summarize the operational definition like I have it in this slide. We know that health was the other variable of interest. If we continue reading, we can find the operational definition for that variable in the last paragraph of the writing instructions section. Although that doesn't really fit with that heading. We can use the highlighted information to summarize the operational definition. I hope, as a side note, that you question the ethics of accessing participants' health center information. We'll learn more about ethical considerations, but access to private information like that is taken very seriously. 2 parts of the method let us know the researchers followed ethical guidelines, and the participants were aware that their health center visits would be reviewed. In the participants, the authors mentioned that the sign-up sheet referred to health center visits, so that would have probably been the first way that potential participants knew the health center was probably involved. Then, in the procedure, they mentioned the consent form, which we'll learn about in more detail later, that included a release for health center data. Now, back to the regularly scheduled program. Your notes on the article summary template should include at least the information included in the example in this slide. Note that this article used a mood measure that appeared to be developed for this study, so there wasn't a citation. The information about the alpha is the reliability and validity information. If you haven't already done so, make sure to add your notes to the corresponding sections of the article summary template before moving on. The Hurst article is a lot different because it's a qualitative study. In this case, that means they didn't start by finding a measure. Instead, they identified articles and looked at themes in the articles. Those themes are the operational definition. The different methodology means the article's formatted differently, so we won't be able to use our knowledge of APA style in the same way. If we think about the purpose of the article, though, we know we're looking for information about how they defined sources of stress for college students. Sources of stress is the main variable. The pages about the articles they looked at help a little, but it's a little overwhelming. When we keep looking, though, we come across a table, Table 2, which gives a list of the stress themes. In other words, it's a list of how they operationalized sources of stress. Now that we know those were the themes, we need to ask how they decided on those themes. In quantitative research, we want to know where they found the measure and how they knew it measured what they wanted to measure. We ask similar questions with qualitative research. Where did they find those themes, and how did they decide those were the themes? To find that information, we need to go back up a little and start skimming the methods section. The beginning of the first paragraph summarizes how they started to find the information. I copied and pasted the important information as the first bullet point in the summary. If we keep skimming, we see that the beginning of the second paragraph talked about how many articles they found and how they narrowed them down to find the ones that were relevant. I copied and pasted that information as the second and third bullet points. So far, that just tells us how they narrowed down the articles where they found the themes. So we need to keep reading to see how they decided on the themes. Skimming the rest of the second paragraph, we come across the sentences about the 3 trained coders. That's the beginning of how they decided on the themes. The authors included a few sentences about how they went about coding, but that's less important than knowing that they decided all 3 coders were using the same definitions. In other words, how they decided that the coding was reliable and valid. That's what the authors are explaining when they talk about coefficients and disagreements. So I copied and pasted that for future reference. Now we know how they decided on the themes, but what were those themes? We know that from Table 2, so we could use a screen capture of that. But skimming the paragraphs under the heading of Stress Themes provides additional detail. I copied and pasted from those paragraphs to add notes in the worksheet. Now that you've learned about the process and seen my model, use the PDF file of the Hurst article to complete the variable section of that worksheet. Then, look at O'Hara and Share. It's a quantitative article, so you can use the strategies we learned about for Burton and King for that worksheet. O'Hara and Share have 2 hypotheses that included 3 variables. The operational definition of gender is typically self-report, so we don't need to look for that, but we'll skim the methods section for the information for the other variables. The measures heading on page 34 of the article helps signal we might be in the right place, and the first paragraph confirms that we are. We can use the highlighted information to summarize the operational definition for stress. The title of the measure is used as a heading in this article, and the citation is actually for an article by one of the same authors who wrote the article. They use the term validity to discuss that information, which makes it easier to find. We know we need to keep reading to find the operationalization for the substance abuse measure, and it's also helpful to remember that the hypothesis listed 3 ways they operationalized the variables: the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, or audit, the Alcohol Change Index, and the frequency of marijuana use. The header on page 35 of the article signals that the section will include information about the audit. You might have already noticed that this is similar to what we've learned about APA-style content, but the information could be presented more clearly. For example, it would have been helpful to write out the full title of the measure in the heading instead of the abbreviated title. I think using the full title would actually also be more consistent with APA. I also can't find a citation for the audit in the article. If it was consistent with APA style, it'd be in the hypothesis directly after the name of the measure and in the first sentence of the section about the measure where they identify the instrument and explain the content. The citations in the second paragraph are for information about reliability and validity, which does signal credibility because those are other published articles where the measure was used. Without the information in the hypothesis, it might have been easy to overlook the additional operationalizations of substance abuse since they start on the next page. It's always good practice to continue to skim the method, though, in case the authors don't give another signal that there are multiple operationalizations. Here's how a model of this section of the worksheet might look for this article. At this point, you might be wondering why we would want to note or copy all of the details I include in the worksheet. There are 2 reasons. The first is that the operational definitions help us understand what the authors really mean when they talk about the variables, so we know if they're talking about what we think they're talking about. If there's a citation, it also lets us know there's been a lot of work done to make sure the measure is reliable and valid, so the citation signals it's a credible measure. The other reason is because the notes can help us later when we design a study. If we want to study a variable that was also included in another study, we can go back and see how they operationalized it. If it was a self-report measure, having the citation in our worksheet notes can help us see if we can use the measure for our study. Referring back to the focus of the article helps us know what variables were included in the study, so we have a better idea of what we're looking for in the methods. You might have gotten the impression the information about the operational definitions can be presented in a number of different ways, and that's an accurate impression. So we've noticed authors don't always present measures consistently within an article, let alone across the articles, so it's helpful to skim the entire method section. We go to that trouble because it helps us understand what the authors are really talking about when they discuss their findings. Having the names of the measures in the citations when it's available can also be helpful for later stages of the research process.